Morning everybody, how are we doing today? Today we're going to discuss one of the great families in jazz, the fantastic Jones brothers. I had a hum in a couple of my last episodes that you hear when the music was kind of quiet and I wasn't talking. Turns out it was that ceiling fan back there that's not spinning right now. That sucker was buzzing on me, and it's weird what this microphone picks up and doesn't pick up, I guess. But anyway, the Jones brothers are one of the great families in jazz, and not only do they tell an incredible music story, they tell an incredible social story, and they mirror a lot of the black experience in America. They're from Vicksburg, Mississippi, and only Hank of the three boys was born in Vicksburg. Thad and Elvin were both born in Pontiac, Michigan, which is basically Detroit. But that's why we got some love here for Detroit and Mr. Gordie Howe, one of the great hockey players of all time. But the Jones brothers are a great story in jazz, and they really are omnipresent throughout the 40s and 50s and 60s, into the 70s and 80s and 90s even. They're really part of so many of the movements of jazz. They make countless records. They have a huge impact. They play with just about everybody in the business. And they go on to win numerous awards for lifetime achievement, especially Hank Jones, who's seen as one of the great artists in jazz history. But first, a little background here. Being born in Vicksburg, Mississippi, Hank was born in 1918. So that's the Second World War is just First World War is just wrapping up. That's gonna put him and his brothers, who were born in the 20s, as young boys / teenagers during the Depression. An incredibly tough time for a lot of Americans, and even more so for black Americans. The opportunities were just not there. The unemployment was high. It was a scary time, and a number of the boys served in the Army and even in World War II, if I recall correctly. But there were just limited options for black youth, and being in the South especially, it was a very dangerous place. And when the Jones family picked up and moved up to Pontiac, Michigan in probably 1920, 21, 22, in there somewhere, because I believe Thad's born in 23 and he was born in Pontiac, so they had to have moved somewhere there in the early 20s, I'm guessing. America was going through Prohibition. There was a sense of the roaring 20s and opportunity and optimism still in the 20s. The great industrial cities of the heartland around the Great Lakes were starting to really boom. Manufacturing was an important part of Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland and Buffalo, Milwaukee, Toledo, Dayton. All these cities were what have become the Rust Belt and are actually now being reborn yet again, and are being rejuvenated and rebuilt. But these Rust Belt cities in the 20s were boom cities. The manufacturing jobs were plentiful, and there wasn't enough white bodies to fill the factories, and there was work for young black men. And Detroit is one of the great cities in American history, and she's on the hard times of the 90s and 2000s. We've all heard the stories about the great decline of the urban fabric, and Detroit's the poster child for that urban decay. And it's really crazy when you look at footage of European cities and even Canadian cities right across the border. The abject poverty that unregulated capitalism creates is stark. And because of that inequality, that's a foundation of your economic principles, it allows race, almost demands race, remain a constant part of the dialogue, a constant part of the experience. The American fabric dictates so much of the jazz narrative. It's not some isolated thing. They don't exist separate from each other. And the opportunity was there for the young black men in Detroit and these other cities, which was great. But it also puts together large neighborhoods of African Americans in these great northern cities, and those pockets of people, African American migrants from the South. It creates a community, and it creates a musical opportunity for these people to have first local success and demand for the music, and then eventually they branch out into the wider national scene. And Detroit is one of the great birthplaces of musicians, not just in jazz, but absolutely jazz was Detroit was one of the great cities that birthed a lot of these great men. And of course, going into the soul movement, that continues. But we're going to get to the Jones Brothers now. So their experience moving from the South into a more of a, I won't say lower middle class even, because you're never that in America if you're black. You know, especially in these days and eras and times, 30s, 40s, 50s, it was just tough. And they start to really rise to prominence as musicians, all of them from a young age. They have 6 or 7 brothers and sisters, so it's a big family. There's a lot of demand. You kind of have to scrape and crawl over each other to be noticed. And so let's talk about Hank first. Born in 1918, born in Mississippi. He dies in 2010 in the Bronx, so I think he outlived both his brothers, honestly. He has his name as a leader on over 60 LPs. In 1989, the National Endowment of the Arts gave him a Jazz Master Award. He is the guy playing piano on Marilyn Monroe's Happy Birthday. In 44, Lucky Thompson hears him, invites him to move to New York, where he plays with Hot Lips Page. And Norman Granz discovers him, and he starts recording in the Philharmonic bands and a lot for Clef in that early days, and he's the accompanist for a lot of Ella Fitzgerald's great recordings. And Hank continues making great music and develops as a player and as a stylist, and becomes truly one of the great American musicians of all time. And there's probably few players of more importance that are less heralded than Hank Jones. He's just a giant in so many ways. His playing is elegant, it's dynamic, it's rhythmic. He can be pulsing and swinging. He can be the most sophisticated. He just has a complete package. And from his earliest recordings as a leader, where here we're going to look at some of the stuff he does very early on. He's already done a lot of work as a sideman, but here in probably 1955, Savoy number 1203, this is what's considered his first record. It's along with Kenny Clark and Wendell Marshall, 3 young black guys in Newark, New Jersey, given the chance by Herman Lubinsky to record. And we're of course listening to a Savoy record of him right now, Have You Met Hank Jones? And I think this is all solo stuff, which is nice. So let's put on a little bit of this Wendell Marshall, Kenny Clark record. Once you add that pulse of the bass and the drums in there, it really changes the feel. And that groove, that is the sexuality and sensuality of the African American dancing to find freedom in spite of his struggles, which I've talked about in numerous episodes. It's just alive. It's tangibly alive. It's dense. it's irrepressible. It's powerful. The magic in this music isn't in the virtuosity. The magic isn't in the instruments they play. The magic isn't in the vinyl that's pressed on. The magic isn't in the guy who engineered the session. The magic comes completely from me finding freedom for my oppressor. And we as white Americans, and I'm a Canadian, we can't ever grasp what it felt like to live in terror and to be a victim and not to be free in your own country. We don't know what it's like to have lived in the South and to feel hatred that's so vitriolic, to have gone to war to free people on another continent and come home and still not be free. To see Detroit as this place of opportunity, but still the struggles and the abject poverty, the lack of equality, the lack of equal schooling, the lack of clean water in our neighborhoods and policing our neighborhoods. It's the black experience informs all of the magic that is jazz. That powerful emoting, expressing my condition, that's it. It's got nothing to do with any of the other shit. All this distraction, I see some other YouTube channels, and this guy was talking about the grams and the pressing, and no, it isn't about any. I honestly, I've looked at a couple other YouTube channels just to get some ideas and see what other people are doing, and I'm surprised how much people aren't saying. I was just talking to my friend Jean-Michel Reisler from Switzerland about this. How much can you talk about a record without some insight into the times it was made and the culture that surrounds it and makes it and informs it? This quintet record is a fantastic Savoy record. We're talking 12,037, so the 37th release, and has a young Donald Byrd, which is fantastic. It's got Eddie Jones on the bass and Kenny Clark, and a guy by the name of Matty Dice plays on the trumpet a little bit, who I can't say I've even seen that name before. And Matty Dice sounds like it could be a pen name to allow him to record, but I'll have to look that up at some point. This is another great trio record with Paul Chambers, Kenny Clark, and they add the flute of Bobby Jasper on some of the tracks. Fantastic record, number 12,087. And then we're going to dig into this one a little bit here as well. These 5 old Savoy records of Hank Jones are all fantastic pieces. And I would recommend people look for them, seek them out, and grab them. It's some of my favorite stuff on the Savoy label. I love their cheesy, out-of-date art department. I just think it's fantastic. It looks like something from a 1950s textbook that was cutting edge, sort of, but was dated tomorrow. Like, it just has that feel to it. The color schemes, it's just all of that. But Hank Jones and Wendell Marshall, Kenny Clark, and then they do add Joe Wilder, Herbie Mann, Donald Byrd. It says Matty Dice again. I can't believe I've never noticed that. Jerome Richardson and Eddie Jones. So this is a fantastic record with a number of the guys coming through and making appearances. Lubinsky and Savoy do make some great recordings in the mid-50s, you know, and of course the glory years of Savoy predate that by a large stretch. You know, when they're recording Parker right after the war, that's kind of the pinnacle of what Savoy was doing and what Savoy was about. Hank Jones shows up on Infinite Sessions. Here's a record he does on Capitol, The Talented Touch. This one's not too hard to come by. There's another one on Capitol where he's doing Porgy and Bess that I've not picked up for some reason. I've seen it a few times, but I was found probably a car full of other things. This is a great record on Argo, and I think Kenny Burrell's on it if I recall. And this is one of the toughest Argo records to come by. Kenny Burrell at the Vanguard, Hank Jones, Kenny Burrell, Milt Hinton, and Elvin Jones. So Elvin's playing with his brother here. I can't say enough about Hank Jones. He's just a great player with a great touch, always a sense of the melodic principle. Like, he never abandons the melodic principles. That's the essence of music. It's what makes something stick in your head and be hummable. Without melody, we're lost. And I believe the guys, Hank Jones, when I hear them talk about this stuff, they've lived through so much. If anyone's capable of saying what's jazz and what's not jazz, it's a guy like Hank Jones. So reverence for Hank Jones. We kind of sleep on him. His name, maybe because it's a little bit of a vanilla name, Hank Jones, it doesn't really kind of ring out like, you know, a name like Coltrane or Miles or Monk. Hank Jones is just kind of like guy next door-y, just in terms of the name. And I'm not even going to take this out. This is another record he does on Impulse, probably 62, 63, I'm guessing. Oh no, it's probably later than that, more like 64, 65, it's 132. But it's got Clark Terry, and it's got Oliver Nelson arrangements. And once you give Oliver Nelson the keys of the car, there's going to be a lot of racket made on that shit. You know, Oliver Nelson's arrangements are pretty big and brassy and almost kind of counter a guy like Hank Jones' beautiful playing. And of course, we must not forget that the great Cannonball Adderley Something Else record with Miles Davis is with Hank Jones and Sam Jones and Art Blakey. And that Hank Jones is playing on Autumn Leaves is as beautiful as anything anyone else in the group does. This is the 5x5 record by Thelonious Monk. And I pulled this out because this is a great example of a sideman record of Thad Jones. We're going to talk about Thad Jones next. He was the next in line age-wise, born in 23, born in Pontiac. And Thad has a fairly long discography as well. He's making records much, much later than what I have collected by. Most of my collection is going to be 50s and 60s for almost all these artists. But Thad was a great trumpet player, one of the great soloists, and in a lot of people's minds, he's one of the unheralded trumpet players of this era. He's got a great tone, a nice, tight, clean embouchure. There's some Dizzy Gillespie, some Clifford Brown in his playing. He's really capable of playing the hard bop medium fantastically well. He was versed in bebop. Just a great player. He played with Count Basie for quite a long time, and he actually pens numerous songs like The Deacon, Her Royal Majesty, Counterblock. There's an LP called Dancing with Basie where he does all the arrangements and then he's uncredited for it. Thad Jones, Mel Lewis is a group that comes along later that makes a lot of great records. But here's a record he makes, probably one of his first. I gotta check something real quick. Yeah, this is his first. This is on Debut, which was Charles Mingus' little label. Only lasted a couple years, and then they sold it to Fantasy. And then Fantasy, of course, because it owned it, it becomes part of OJC much later down the road. But you can hear, even here, as a young guy, he's already played with Basie and those guys for a while. So he's already got lots of experience. He's playing with Frank West, Hank Jones, Max Roach, Kenny Clark, Charles Mingus. So there's some pretty heavyweights knocking that record out with them right there. Now Thad moves, to Blue Note. And he makes 3 of my favorite Blue Note records in the middle of the 1500 series. And he's really got kind of his own sound and look to what he's doing. There's a whole movement starting at Blue Note. And it never really feels like Thad Jones is going to be just another part of that Blue Note hard bop movement. He's always got kind of his own thing. He reminds me a little bit of Kenny Dorham in that aspect. he wasn't a sideman on a lot of the other guys' records. He wasn't showing up with Mobley and Donald Byrd. He wasn't playing with Lee Morgan. He was pretty much doing a lot of his own stuff. Probably because he had a pretty big name compared to those other kids at this point. But Kenny Burrell's on the guitar, Tommy Flanagan's on the piano, the great Oscar Pettiford, one of the great bass players that's kind of unknown, sadly. Billy Mitchell's on the tenor sax, and Shadow Wilson. Great record, great album cover, great Reed Miles layout. It's great Blue Note. It sounds fantastic. I'm guessing this was Van Gelder. I don't see her off the top of my head. But this is early Blue Note. This is 1513. And so this might even be from 54, 55. But it does seem like it's all one group. Yeah, so it's probably from a session in 55. So it's probably one of the first LPs Blue Note puts out that's an intact one recording session with one group that was designed to be a 12-inch LP. The first stuff before this was pretty much all stuff from the 10-inch era and earlier that, Kenny Burrell. I love Kenny Burrell. This is one of my favorite album covers in the jazz canon. It's Thad with the pigeons somewhere. I'm guessing it's New York. It could be Detroit, but it's probably New York. And here's Thad Jones Volume 3, also on Blue Note. And all three of these records are, I consider, along my favorites in the Blue Note canon. This is Thad Jones again with Billy Mitchell, the young Barry Harris on the piano, who I love, Percy Heath, and Max Roach. So again, you're not seeing him playing with a lot of the other Blue Note royalty, as it were. He's kind of got his own vision, like Kenny Dorham. Here again, we got Benny Powell on the trombone, Gigi Grice on the alto sax, Tommy Flanagan, George Duvivier, and Elvin Jones. Max Roach is on a track or two. So beautiful Blue Note. These are classic vinyl reissues from the early 2000s. Fantastic artwork. These three Blue Notes are three of my favorite Blue Notes, and I love the hard bop guys because it's so charged, it's so political, it's so intense. Yet there's also a part of me that loves the more relaxed take on this era that you get from Thad Jones here. This is on the Period label, which was jazz critic Leonard Feather's short-lived label. And it's hard to find originals of anything on the Period label. I think I might have one thing. I'll have to look. Maybe a Django Reinhardt. Did they do that on a Period? But quite a lot of guys on this. Jimmy Jones, Eddie Jones, Elvin Jones, Joe Jones, Quincy Jones, and a few intruders. Frank Foster, Frank West, Tommy Flanagan, Harry Coker, Doug Watkins. As far as I know, only Elvin's his brother of all those Jones. And it's Joe Jones, so I'm guessing that's Papa Joe Jones. Plus a young Quincy Jones. That's crazy. I didn't realize Quincy played with him. But this is a great session. It doesn't sound to me quite as good as the Blue Note stuff from the same time frame. And I think it was recorded in 55, 56. And so this was a one session recording. So it's Leonard giving Thad a chance to put a big band together and make some great hard driving big band hard bop crossover modern jazz. He makes a couple records at Prestige, and technically they were more Prestige jam sessions, as Prestige was well known to do. It was Who Showed Up Today. That's how these six guys record together. And so this Oleo record, it's not really a Thad Jones record, even though he's got the first billing. Frank West, Teddy Charles, Mal Waldron, and Doug Watkins. Great record. And this is one of the hardest old Prestige records to come by, and one of the most expensive. This is OJC, of course, but if you find an old copy of this, even that's beat to shit, it's going to go into the hundreds of dollars. I've seen really nice copies climb close to $1,000. Not something you can afford on a layman's salary, that's for sure. I think it's funny that some uber rich people have these large collections of mint jazz recordings that I wonder if they really cherish, or is it just status for them? Is it just a Ming vase on their shelf, or do you really get that stuff? Are you really digging into the culture and understanding it, or is it just a showpiece? You know what I mean? If you have a Ming vase, you should know where that culture was, what river valley it flourished in. If you can't tell me that, you shouldn't own the vase. If you can't tell me something about these jazz records and the culture and the community they were made in, you probably shouldn't own a collection of old Blue Notes. You should probably let someone who gives a shit about that music have that. You know? I don't think people who grab culture just so people can look at them and go, oh, look at that guy, he's got such culture. Those people should be ashamed of themselves. If you don't really understand it, you don't really crave it and thirst for it, don't do it to impress others. Because you're going to be exposed, you're going to be seen as a phony eventually. And for the most part, if you don't know what valley the Ming vase came from in China, 3 questions in, the average person's going to be like, this guy is an idiot. They're not going to be praising you. They're going to be like, you are a shallow despot. This is a great record, After Hours. It's another one of those prestige kind of jam sessions with Frank West, Mal Waldron, Tenny Charles, Kenny Burrell, Doug Watkins, Art Taylor. And some of those names actually aren't on After Hours. This is one of those twofers where they put Oleo with After Hours. But thankfully it has the actual After Hours cover, which is a great shot of the New York street scene. Another one of those kind of prestige thrown together jam sessions. But those records do have their place. There's a looseness to them because it's not super produced. It's not arranged. It's just, this is what we're going to do. And that actually keeps those records having a freshness to them that I really like. My friend Jean-Michel from Switzerland turned me onto this record, and it's a great find. The short-lived Metro Jazz label. And this was a rare example of Thad, Hank, and Elvin all recording together on this session. The Jones brothers. And Isham Jones plays, is it the bass, I think, on this record? Would have to be, right? But it's a great little session. It moves along nicely. You kind of feel like, for the lack of these guys playing together on recordings, you get the feeling they played together plenty as young men. And when they went into the studio, Thad, Elvin, and Hank, they were just reminiscent. Remember when? See if you remember this one. You know, there's just a kind of a comfort and a shared dialogue between these guys. Another great record Thad Jones is seen as a leader on. And this is going to mirror, once again, his Blue Note kind of lineups with Billy Mitchell, Al Gray, Tommy Flanagan, Paul Chambers, and Elvin Jones. This is also a very hard record to find on United Artists. This is a Japanese pressing. Old United Artists of this record are usually the $200, $300, $400 range for a nice, really good copy. So again, I'll go buy the $25 version from Japan. And I've never been disappointed with the Japanese pressing of anything. Lastly, we're going to move on to Elvin Jones. And Elvin, of course, makes his name and cuts his teeth with John Coltrane as part of that great quintet from 60 to 66. He was born in 27. He lived in New York, went to New York in 55. He plays with Mingus and Teddy Charles, Bud Powell. He makes a great record with Mingus and Miles called Blue Moods from early 50s, probably 53, maybe a little later. But it's, again, this is on the debut label, which was that short-lived Mingus label. And that's a really solid record. It's contemplative. It's in the pocket. Here's Elvin Jones and Company. This is a Riverside record he got as a leader with his brother Thad. His brother Hank's on this too. Frank West is on the flute. Frank Foster's on the tenor. Art Davis plays the bass. I forgot his brothers were on this. It's awesome. This is a great record. Of course, Riverside doesn't really make not good records, but let's give a little spin to this, especially since his brothers are both on it. It's just such an important time in music. You know, jazz music was really coming to this pinnacle. And there were social movements happening across the country that was shaping the future of the country. There was an electricity in the streets. There was a sense that we were moving away from believing government, believing the media. It all creates kind of an interesting cross-stitching. And the black experience in America is so stuck in that fulcrum. You know what I mean? It's just, there's no escaping it. And what's good times for everybody else is going to be less good times for the black community. And what's bad times for everybody else, those are going to be some tough times in black America. And again, it's the constructs of our economic situation that really forces them to keep race on the tip of our tongue as an issue. And we use it to explain and express why I have and you don't, why you don't have, the killing each other, the divide, the lack of understanding, the lack of empathy. It's all necessary to keep people believing in the I deserve what I got, you don't deserve nothing mentality. The whole idea of those who kill first with the biggest gun deserve all the wealth. It takes a lot of believing in evil and sin for that to feel normal. And I'm not religious, but it's a sin to ignore the plight of your fellow man. It's a sin to live in the world today and not recognize your place within this cosmos and you're part of this human patchwork. If you somehow separated yourself and your group from the rest of the quilt, shame on you. I mean, you completely missed the point. During Elvin Jones' great run with Coltrane, Impulse is happy to give him a few records as a leader. And this was Elvin Jones and the bass player Jimmy Garrison, also from Coltrane's quartet. Some cool covers of the two fellas. They got their little brown headphones on. This one's got a little mold in it, I forgot about that. Prince Lasha shows up here on the clarinet and flute, Sonny Simmons on the alto sax, Charles Davis on the baritone, and McCoy Tyner is also on this. So you pretty much got the Coltrane. Elvin Jones feature McCoy Tyner. You pretty much got the Coltrane quartet minus Coltrane. But you can hear it's a pretty intense Coltrane-esque new thing. Simmons and Prince Lasha and Charlie Davis, they're all kind of pushing the boundaries and kind of chomping at the bit because Coltrane said it was possible. This is another heavy record on Impulse. Lovely original pressing of this. This is Impulse 88. So we're probably 64, 65 now. And the lineup on this is his brother Hank Jones, Charlie Mariano, one of my favorite white tenor players, Richard Davis, and Roland Hanna. It's a tribute to Coltrane. Coltrane is affectionately saluted by his Minister of Creative Percussion in the sparkling collection of trio and quartet performances. It's interesting they chose Charlie Mariano to embody Coltrane. It's kind of an interesting choice, but Charlie's a great player and he's super under-heralded, and his stuff at Bethlehem for me is some of the best jazz of the mid-50s. Beautiful album cover, beautiful lacquered, great picture of the man. And Elvin's an insane, intense guy. When you watch the Coltrane Quartet play, there's no misgivings about this just being fun and not meaning anything. Elvin is as intense as John throughout most of those footage of them playing live. You can just see that these are beasts of war. This is Heavy Sounds with Elvin Jones and Richard Davis. One of the great jazz smoking album covers. Of course, cigarettes were a fairly common thing. Richard Davis was a great bass player. Billy Green on the piano. Frank Foster on the tenor. These guys, again, you can see the joy on their faces here. And when you're here with that instrument in your hand, that's about as safe as you're going to ever feel as a black guy. That's joyful. Even today during this virus, when I pick up my guitar, I feel less stressed. I feel like, I can express and kind of vent some of it. And these guys, there's a reason why they can be playful and have a little bit of happiness in their life. Great, beautiful record. This is probably 66 at this point. So we're firmly into a lot of the more avant-garde edges of the music. Interesting stuff. It's beautiful. Haven't heard this in a long time. Elvin, of course, makes a few records at Atlantic. He made that great record with Philly Joe Jones I showed you yesterday. These are both great records. Some great musicians on them. So there they are at Atlantic. And then here's a record. He does a Blue Note, Mr. Jones. Who's with him in this one? Steve Grossman, Dave Liebman, Pepper Adams is on this. Thad Jones, Jan Hammer, Gene Perla, Frank Ippolito, Albert Duffy, and Carlos Valdez on the conga. Wow. So that's a big ensemble there. Only heard that record once or twice. Then this is a famous record by the great Sonny Rollins. And this is considered one of Rollins' greatest records. And Elvin Jones is part of the fire that drives this train. Elvin's great on that record. It's definitely one of the great Rollins records and an album to look for. And then one other guy I want to mention real quick here. In part because if I don't mention him now, I don't know when I will. But we talked about Philly Joe Jones yesterday. And how Philly is omnipresent in jazz in the 50s and 60s. And that goes the same for Thad Jones, Hank Jones, and Elvin Jones. But there was a fifth Jones, not related here, Sam Jones. And he makes 3 records as a leader on Riverside. This record's outstanding. This record's brilliant. This record's a bigger group with 10 people. I don't like the bigger stuff as much as I like the softer trios and quartets. I think there's better emoting in those contexts. But I even like Ellington stuff in the smaller groups, and when they kind of go to minimal passages, that's where most of my feelings come from. But Blue Mitchell, Jimmy Heath, Clark Terry, Les Spann, Wynton Kelly, Joe Zawinul, and Israel Crosby. Fantastic groups. And Sam Jones is also very important in the music because like Philly Joe Jones and like the Jones brothers, Sam Jones is everywhere. And if you look at the Riverside jazz canon, almost all the great Riverside records Sam Jones is playing bass on. That Blue Note record we mentioned earlier with Hank Jones and Ken Adderley and Miles Davis, Something Else, Sam Jones is playing bass on that. So Jones being kind of a vanilla last name, I think these guys kind of get blended and merged and sidelined, and they don't really stick out with the same prominence of the guys with the more unique names like a Mingus or a Rollins. But Sam Jones is absolutely one of the most important guys in jazz in this era, along with Paul Chambers on the bass. Pettiford dies at a young age. Ray Brown's pretty immersed in the Verve, doing the stuff there. Then he, of course, in the Concord era. But Sam Jones is just a great player. And look for those 3 records he does on Riverside. You gotta love Philly Joe. You gotta love the Jones brothers. You gotta love Sam Jones. But bottom line, you gotta keep it with the Joneses. Gordie Howe. Gotta love Gordie Howe. Appreciate you all. Y'all be safe. We'll talk to you soon on the Jazz Shepherd. Peace.